Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Roberts, head of the ecology department here at Montana State. On behalf of the department and the university, I welcome you, and more importantly, thank you for coming to share with us our thoughts and remembrances of my good friend, Professor Dan Goodman. It's a great honor to be here and to celebrate his life and accomplishments. And in my own personal remarks, I apologize in advance to those of you who aren't scientists if I sometimes go into the arcane, but I find it a little hard to understand Dan without a scientific perspective. So Dan translated what was a lifelong interest in biology, ecology, and the environment into his career. And having grown up in Ohio, attended Ohio State University for his bachelor's degree, and then earned his PhD as well at Ohio State, working with well-known ecologist Professor Colin Bow. And he left Ohio State to go to Cornell for a postdoc at a time when Cornell was clearly one of the premier ecological institutions in the country. And while he was at Cornell, he published his first benchmark paper on the relationship of ecosystem complexity and stability. And he told me one time, and I firmly believe, that he could have ridden the coattails of that paper for much of the rest of his career. But the truth is, the subject didn't really interest him that much, and he walked away. He left Cornell to go to Scripps, one of the absolutely top marine biology programs in the world. And then a little bit after that, left Scripps to come to what was then somewhat less prestigious Montana State University, where he joined what was then the Department of Biology. Over his career, I thought Dan's work exhibited an interesting hybrid approach in that he was clearly on the frontier of his science continually. And yet, at one point, he decided to leave behind ecological theory and move more into an applied realm, working in conservation of threatened and endangered species. And the problems that he tackled were extraordinarily complex, which I know Dan truly enjoyed, but really truly important in a concrete way to the world in which he lived. And so he chose to make his contributions to the science in a way that he could see that impact immediately and effectively. Dan trained a cadre of extraordinary PhD students here at Montana State who have gone on to form much of the backbone of some of the conservation agencies across the U.S. Actually, in some years, Dan graduated more PhDs than the rest of the department put together, and so has a fantastic legacy across the country of graduate students in those positions. I did not know Dan Goodman when I interviewed for my job at Montana State, and like was fairly common, he wasn't here at the time. I think he was in Alaska. And so sometime after that, when I was on campus, we arranged to have lunch. Kind of a little on-campus bistro called The Habit. And it was kind of a surreal lunch and kind of a funny little place. And I remember sitting there thinking that I was in the presence of an extraordinary mind, and yet a very warm and kind soul. You know, at that point, I was officially Dan's boss, but I approached that event quite nervous about making a favorable impression, because I had taken the opportunity since my interview to study up a little bit on Dan's accomplishments, and I really was keen on making that good first impression. So, at that luncheon, Dan told me that the war in statistics was over and that the Bayesians had won. And when I expressed some incredulity about that, he just very politely outflanked me and said, well, certainly in marine systems, it's all over. So he went on after that to regale me with stories about departmental and university politics and the history of events that had happened at the university. And that really never ended. You know, for the next 8 to 9 years that I knew Dan, he was the source of tremendous information and knowledge about the university, including a little bit of skullduggery, I think, to obtain that knowledge. So at one point, during a period of great angst in the ecology department about my leadership and the wisdom of some decisions I had made, Dan took me and my son fishing. So we went out to the Madison River and drove out Bear Trap Canyon and hiked up a ways and fished for the afternoon and then hiked out and drove back home. And we got almost all the way home before Dan said a word about the department. A couple of very carefully chosen words, very carefully spoken, and to the point. Okay. So as long as I had the opportunities to visit with Dan, he would try and keep me out of trouble, and was probably mostly successful. Early on in our friendship, I made what I came to see as an incredible mistake. Because I knew that Dan mostly analyzed data that other people collected, and that really his forte was to take those data and make them speak and to make them be honest. And so I somehow naively thought that maybe Dan was an armchair ecologist. And over the course of several luncheons and many years, I soon realized that there's hardly an acre of Montana that Dan hadn't seen lately. He knew every road, every trail, where the locked gates were, who you had to ask permission from to cross, forest, meadow, prairie, every acre of the state of Montana. And importantly, I think, where the highest concentrations of fish and game were likely to be found, not all of which he was willing to divulge. I think Dan liked fish, and he liked birds, but it seemed to me that he had a special respect for the cleverness of pronghorn. And he told me that when he would go hunting pronghorn, that it gave him the opportunity to walk the earth That's about as basic and fundamental a relationship as an organism can have with the planet. And that was his full intent, was to walk the earth. All of it, I think. But it wasn't just wilderness that Dan came to know so well. Over the stories he told me, that Dan had high standards and high expectations of people, but he celebrated the people that he thought measured up. And so small town mayors, ranchers, automobile mechanics, house painters, all came into the discussions that we had about the people that he knew and appreciated, along with a fairly long list of scoundrels. So we went on to have lunch hundreds of times over the next 8 years. And of course, we would often talk about ecology or department politics. But more often than not, we would wax philosophic about history, philosophy, religion, political science, art. I thought there was no subject that Dan was not the absolute master. So we were so in awe of his knowledge that my friend Bob Bramlett and I decided to try and stump Dan and see if we could find something that he wasn't the master of. And as it turns out, Dan was not the master of pop culture. He knew well the elements of it that transcend generations and that are part of culture writ large. But the truth is the details of current pop culture really just weren't worthy of his interest. So, Dan liked dogs. Not all dogs, mind you. German short-hair pointers, mostly. And a couple of weeks ago, he told me a story. He said that he thought that his senior dog had memorized his walking cadence. And that when Dan would come home from work, when he would get near to the house, the dog would hear him coming and come out to greet him. And he said, well, I don't go home at the same time every day. It's not the clock, it's not the sun. I think it's the cadence of my footsteps on the sidewalk. So, being a scientist, he decided to walk home from a different direction the next day. And sure enough, when he got near the house, out came the dog to greet him. Well, I know how that dog feels. All of these hundreds of lunches that we've had together, usually I'll go first and stake out a little table in the side lunchroom in the student union. And I never knew if Dan or Tad or Bob or someone else was going to come and join me. So I would sit and eat and read, pretty much anything to tell the truth. And on those occasions when Dan would come in, I felt him before I saw him. He would come into the room, and I would look up, and he would smile, seat himself at the table, fold his sunglasses into his left breast pocket without looking, put on his other glasses, and start into another wonderful session of almost any subject imaginable. So I don't know that it was the cadence. I think Dan just had a presence that you could sense. So over the 8 years that I had the opportunity to work with Dan, And one of my objectives was to get as many graduate students as possible into Dan's classes. And the graduate students generally were intimidated by Dan. He was viewed as being mildly eccentric. He's the only academic I ever knew that wore a uniform. But beyond that, he had a formidable intellect that graduate students recognized. And he was actually somewhat candid about bemoaning the fact that graduate students aren't as well prepared as they used to be, and certainly not as well prepared as he would like. But nonetheless, unfailingly, when they would take Dan's class, he would meet them at whatever level they were and work with them and make extraordinary progress. Just phenomenal accomplishments in the classroom. And one of the things that was noteworthy is that Dan was really insistent on something called statistical power. Making sure that if you're going to do a study, you will actually get an answer. Okay? It's not acceptable to get to the end and be surprised that you don't have enough data to answer your question. Or worse yet, to pretend that it's due to the vagaries of nature. That's your responsibility. And I think he opened a lot of eyes of how we ought to go about doing the science that we're trying to do. So I've always referred to Dan as my colleague, and that's not a word that I use lightly. But the truth is, maybe we weren't truly colleagues. We never collaborated on any research projects and never published anything together, at least not yet. Okay. So maybe it's more like we were kindred spirits. Okay. I don't for 1 second consider myself Dan's equal in any way, but we shared some things. Some of them were silly. We both write our computer programs in Fortran. We write our manuscripts in a program called Tech. We have an appreciation for mid-60s General Motors automobiles. And of course, we both have a fondness for bolo ties. But beyond that, I think we shared something more fundamental. And I think that Dan saw a phenomenally complex and beautiful place. But that if you embraced that complexity and you ask yourself, well, how much different could the world be? How many more ways is it possible that the world could be? And then you put your observations in that context and say, well, how unusual is what I see compared to what would be possible to see. Then you eventually come to a place where you can say, well, this is the way the world most likely is. Okay? Not certainty, just most likely to be in a particular way. And that's out of a set of nearly infinite set, but clearly imagined possibilities that had to be considered. So the highest honor that I can bestow on a colleague is to say that they're a gentleman and a scholar. And Dan Goodman defined those terms for me. We're not going to see him again, the likes of him in my lifetime. And I think neither the department nor I are going to be the same. But I take solace in recognizing that if I hadn't taken a job at Montana State, I never would have known Dan. I never would have benefited from his knowledge and insight and wit and friendship. And so I take pride in having earned Dan's respect. But the fact that Dan befriended me is an honor that I will cherish forever. Too soon gone, greatly missed, but truly a source of joy in my life that I'll take with me. Thank you. I'd like to introduce some of Dan's friends who have come from far away for the opportunity to share some other remembrances. First, a longtime friend, Peter Utro, who is a Deputy Director for Science and Policy of EPA's National Homeland Security Research Center, and a longtime friend. Peter?
Thank you. I see that Steve put drinking water here for each of us. I think tissues would have been more appropriate. Back in 1972, Semper Paratus. Back in 1972 or so, I was on the steering committee of a group at Cornell University called the Program on Science, Technology, and Society. I was kind of the kid in the group. There were senior physicists, a chemist, a physician, a sociologist, a lawyer, and I was the person who was kind of representing ecology back in those days. And what we really needed back then was an ecology postdoc. So I was given the opportunity to find one. And I was kind of amazed at the quality of the applications that we received, but one in particular really stood out for me. This was from a guy who received his PhD in ecology from Paul Collinvoe at Ohio State. He wrote his PhD on the paleoecology of something called the Tower Island bird colony. None of us had ever heard of Tower Island, and we finally found it. It was this insignificant, geographically insignificant little islet on the northwest corner of the Galapagos archipelago. This was a person who, in his application, wrote kind of enthusiastically about his experience on something that he called the Great Alaskan Iceworm Expedition. And he wrote about the hunting, the challenge of stalking the wild worm. I checked a little further and I found out this was real. It was real science. He'd written in depth about ecological investigations of iceworms on Casement Glacier in southeast Alaska. And he spent the summer of 1967 on the glacier, and he continued to write articles about them, mostly about how they decay and die. This guy had been around, and I read on. Here's a guy who was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, seemed to have grown up in Ohio, somehow got trained as a sniper in the Israeli army. Said that one of his major goals in life was to structure his career so he'd have lots of time to hunt and fish. Face it, this did not match the image of a nice Jewish boy. There were a bunch of other weird, odd references. Weird will stand out, I suspect, in all of our stories, in his narrative. But I was really hooked. We brought him into Cornell for an interview, and he really blew us all away. Not only was he brilliant, but his grasp of history and breadth of education and philosophy, you didn't expect this from a scientist or a mathematician. And And then there was his appearance. And obviously, we're talking about Daniel. And this was pre-uniform days. Never saw him in khaki until probably about the time that he bought a pair of khakis at a sporting goods store in Ithaca, but didn't start wearing them seriously until he got to Scripps, where they found him peculiar as well, but that's another story. But he showed up. I mean, what he had to do was wear something that nobody else wore. This was the 70s. This was the end of the 60s. What did Dan wear all the time? A dark suit and a regular tie. And I'm wearing this in his honor today. Just like a number of people have said they really should have come in khaki. But he looked like somebody you really had to be careful of. I mean, he looked like he came off the slopes of a mountain in, I don't know whether I should say Montana, maybe here I should say Idaho. But you didn't think of this as somebody who came from urban Ohio by way of Jerusalem. It just made no sense. You can visualize Dan. I mean, no khaki, a black beard rather than a gray beard, a large flat-brimmed hat, and interestingly, always a very elegant leather briefcase, which was succeeded several years later by a violin case. But we took him out to dinner, and we were just enchanted by the stories that he was telling. He was funny, and he had stories to tell, and he had a wry sense of humor. We were laughing out loud. And that was pretty much 40 years ago this month. And we decided to hire him, and he accepted, and we've kind of remained friends ever since. Dan stayed at Cornell for over 3 years, and our friendship grew. We spent a lot of professional and personal time together, social time. He was, as I'm sure you all know, a creature of habit. I wouldn't go so far as to pick a DSM description out of there, but he had his idiosyncrasies. And we'd always get together at meals, sometimes at one of our houses, sometimes at Ithaca restaurants. And I'd always be fascinated by his unshakable practice back then of eating the food on his plate sequentially. He would finish a vegetable, then he'd eat the meat, or the fish, and then the potatoes, or the rice. And only when he had finished all of this would he have the soft drink or the tea that he had ordered. The routine never varied. The contents could change. I remember the time that one of our graduate students came back from having spent 2 months in Alaska and brought some stuff back with him. And he and Dan decided, it was September, I think, or no, it couldn't have been September, but in any case, they decided it was the spring, I apologize, and they decided that this would have the makings of a really interesting Passover Seder. So, there's nothing strong, weird about having a Passover Seder at Passover, but in this case, all the food, instead of the traditional Jewish food, was made out of moose, partridge, moss, seaweed, and salmon. But that was fine. It was actually quite delicious. I mean, if I were to be really honest, it was probably better than most Pesach meals. But Dan sort of put a damper on it by starting to remember that since this stuff had come from Alaska, he started reminiscing about his iceworm days and went into a fairly elaborate and somewhat disgusting discussion of how iceworms putrefy. It didn't do much for our appetites. Well, some things never changed. Daniel always loved being outdoors. In Ithaca, as here, he'd head off to hunt birds or deer in the hills outside Ithaca. He'd canoe or fish on one of the Finger Lakes or the tributaries, but maybe the most interesting experience that I can remember outdoors was the day that he called me up and said, you know, in the next day or two, we ought to paddle down a quiet creek that flowed onto the Cornell campus. The problem was that he wanted to do it on the day of the spring melt. This baby creek was a raging torrent in some places, and it would be a real understatement to say that this was a big mistake. We headed off in 2 cars. We left my car just north of the Cornell campus, and then we drove together I don't remember, a dozen, 15 miles upstream, with a canoe kind of tied onto the top of one of Daniel's. Dan had a large car, of course. We launched the canoe, we set off. We had a delightful hour's ride past about 6 miles of forest and farmland, through beautiful gorges, a little bit of white water, until we came upon what was maybe the second or the third really wide spot in this creek. And that's where we discovered a phenomenon that until then neither of us had done anything except read about. Standing waves. We paddled, and that canoe would not move. We were stuck in the trough between two wave crests, and pretty soon the water came over those wave crests, and the crests started feeding water into the canoe. And this all mentally is happening in slow motion. I have no idea how long it really took. And of course the canoe sank, and we lost the canoe. And we were there in probably 8 or 10 foot deep water with ice chunks running through it. It was cold, so we both struggled our waterlogged way to shore, swimming fully clothed through the water, dragging ourselves onto the rocks, laying down on our back in the sun like the cold-blooded animals we temporarily were, just trying to get warm. We were cold, we were wet, we were exhausted, but we survived. And Dan thought that was pretty impressive. So we started figuring out how to hike out of there, and we did. And one of the first things we did was encounter a small road in a school bus full of 6-year-olds who opened their windows and started going, "Nah, nah, 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 you lose your canoe?" But they didn't stop. So we used our well-honed wilderness skills to really do the only thing we could under those circumstances. We waited and we hitchhiked. And we hitched a ride back to the car, and 2 days later the local police in Ithaca reported that the crumpled ruins of a grummaned aluminum canoe had mysteriously appeared behind a dam several miles below where we went down, but that no bodies had yet been found. We snuck back that evening. We retrieved the canoe, and Daniel took it and very artistically made a little pile of dirt in his backyard and dug a little hole as well, and put it there, this bizarre, ultra-modern, sculptural-looking thing, standing, well, it wasn't standing any longer, but you get the idea, in his backyard as an artwork where I suspect it remains today, probably as a reminder to Daniel, mostly of whom he should never, ever, ever go canoeing with again. We had good times elsewhere as well. He was very sweet. He shared with me time together with his mom on visits to Israel, and we remained close after he went to Scripps, where I'd often fly out and visit and work with him, and he'd fly back and we'd work together. And my parents absolutely adored Daniel. They were European immigrants. They lived in New York City. But they had fallen in love with La Jolla. It's sort of like, who wouldn't, at least for visiting? And they would go there for 2 weeks every year, and without fail, Daniel would visit with them at the La Valencia Hotel and have dinner with them and show them a few parts of California they would never have seen otherwise. But what he wanted out of them were the stories of pre-war Europe. And watching them interact was really a joy. Dave talked about his science. I won't much, although his work on the population ecology of ocean gyres was superb. Dan really was never quite at home at Scripps. In a sense, he was at home, since he didn't have any other place to live, and for many, many months he had 3 file cabinets that were lined up next to one another in his office, and at night he would unroll a sleeping bag and crawl up on top of the file cabinets, unroll the sleeping bags, and sleep there, and shower in the room that the people who came in off the boats would would use. His dean didn't have a sense of humor. They told him he had to do something about it, and Dan, impetuously, which was actually rare for him, went out and bought a house. The only problem was that the only house that he could afford was about an hour away in traffic in a part of San Diego that I don't think anybody would live in on purpose if they had the option of living somewhere else. And he lasted for probably 2 to 3 months before the traffic and the time lost in doing this just got the better of him. So he rented the house out, used the income as rent to share a house in Del Mar with some other people, and I remember them as some of the nicest and weirdest people I ever met, but mostly it seems I would meet them in their hot tub. That was California in the 1970s. But even with the wonderfully weird people in the deserts and the mountains nearby, you guys know Dan, Southern California simply was not for him. And that's really what pulled him to Montana. And Montana was the place that he had first encountered when he was in college. And he took his first drive west across the United States. And he could never stop talking about this amazing state that he had been to and that he had fallen in love with as a college student. And when the MSU job opened up, I remember he called up and said, I finally know where I'm going, and damn it, I'm going to go there. And he said this before he got the job. And of course he did. He came to Bozeman and he stayed and he met Diane and they married, and together they had Raleigh, and whenever Dan would visit us in Washington, he actually wore a suit to our wedding in the post-khaki days. So we felt we really were honored. But he really spoke of nothing with greater joy than how fortunate he was to have found a loving wife and such really a wonderful, beautiful, intelligent, and particularly free-spirited daughter. Professionally, Dan's contributions to science and public policy were huge. And I wanted to talk for a moment about a few things that it's possible that several people in the room don't know about. And I suspect that each of the speakers will have stories like this, because Dan really had an extraordinary ability to compartmentalize his life. We're only now finding out about things that he had done. But the 1975 paper, which you referred to before, the diversity stability paper, it really rocked the ecological community, and it's one of the best-known foundational analyses in ecology today. But it was a statistical analysis, and it's part of what got him hooked on statistics. He realized he didn't care that much about diversity stability, but I think it was the first thing that really showed him the power of what statistics could do. He had worked with Bob Whitaker at Cornell. He actually worked with a bunch of weird people at Cornell too. Bob Whitaker, I remember, would write all his papers. He had a typewriter, and he didn't like to stop to change paper because it would change his thought pattern. So he bought paper in rolls, like toilet paper, and he would just keep going and type and type and type till he had to go to the bathroom or something. Then he would take them off, and in the evening he would cut them up with a scissor, and the next day he would give them to somebody to read and to edit. His other guru was Bruce Wallace, the youngest person ever elected to the National Academy of Sciences and a geneticist. And while we were there, Bruce was trying to breed fruit flies that could grow in cow urine. He was an evangelist for Bayesian statistics before Bayes was cool. And what he did was really apply that statistical analysis to what were key issues of the day. He started out with me doing work on risk assessment on a project that we had gotten funding for, and he then moved on to acid rain, to global climate change, and most recently, and that's the part that people here may not be as well aware of, to a bunch of national security issues. And when Dan was in Washington, in addition to the fish and the marine mammal work that many other people may mention, he served on National Academy committees. He was a member of the Environmental Protection Agency's Science Advisory Board. He was an advisor to the President's Office of Science and Technology Policy. He was an advisor to the Department of Homeland Security, and quietly holding some of the highest security clearances that exist in the United States to several parts of the intelligence community. He was the soul of integrity, and everyone who dealt with him quickly realized that Dan was simply not a go-along-to-get-along kind of guy, and that he'd give straight and honest science-based answers no matter what the consequences were. And in Washington, and I can't speak to here, Dan was a remarkable teacher of people who were not his students and didn't really share, well, maybe his nuanced view of the world. And I watched him time and time again, kind of in awe, not so much show people why they were wrong, but watch him gently bring them around to an understanding or a point of view that was diametrically opposed to what they had initially believed, while getting them to feel that this new idea was entirely theirs and that they were convincing him. It was always this completely ego-free, virtuoso performance. Now, the ego came in the fact that he was really proud of his ability to do this, but he never let on. It really pains me now to think of how much good work may never get done, because so many of us developed such an absolute dependence on Dan's mind and his unique personality and his skill. He really was one of a kind. Dan was tempered by his years here in Montana. He developed a healthy appreciation, I think, of what he could change and what he couldn't. I'd like to close. I read an essay last week and thought of Dan, and it occurred to me that this was probably what Dan would have written years from now had he been given the chance. Now, we're talking about Daniel. I would much rather have found some perfectly arcane gem of an idea from an obscure medieval scholar who he had quoted to me. This is a bit more local. I found this short essay by a man named Jerome Lamb, a journalist, a philosophical journalist who published a newsletter called The Small Voice just next door in North Dakota in the mid-1950s, in the mid part of the last century, starting in the 1940s. And somehow, as I read it, I heard Dan's voice. And reflecting on his own career, Lamb wrote this. I'm going to read it. It's cause for elation to see one's own words in print. But I've learned that despite my frequent and sound advice, the world has not become a noticeably more peaceable kingdom. Folly abounds, incompetence waxeth, integrity waneth, nonsense prevail, thieves multiply, power corrupts. Still spectacular things go on in the sky, forms and colors and movements, cloudscapes and sunscapes so awesome. I ought to spend every day standing on the rooftop clapping and calling for more. And while I'm at it, I'll applaud the landforms too. The subtle way the gray groves roll into the brown, then black fields, the rise of the stark butte from dusty slope, the long river twisting down the valley. Slowly I learn bits of what there is to see, and then forget it so I can learn again. And I learn too that mortality is the stuff of life. Learn how soon the young get old, how short a while forever is. It's sad to stand on the hill and one by one see the lights go out around you. Sad to know the paper has begun to yellow before the pencil gets to the bottom of the page. To realize that there won't be time enough to get it all done. The chores, the kid raising, the sitting on the porch to watch the swallows dart at dusk. The major work. But there's something reassuring too in understanding that death, is nature's and life's and God's way of letting us know that we were never meant to save the world single-handedly, to keep the sun aloft, to keep this old globe spinning. What we're meant to do, I hope, is to fill some small and temporary slot, to give off a little light for a little while, and then lie down. I'm comfortable with that, with the notion of being a small voice yapping away at the edge of a large prairie in the northern half of a large planet. One of many voices, neither the wisest nor the best, but mine, and fairly close to as good as I can make it. Ellen and I would like to offer our thanks to Dan's family and the university for giving us the chance to share a few words to honor our great friend. Our hearts go out to you guys, especially to Diane and Raleigh, and to all of you who loved him like we did. We're going to miss him enormously and will continue to for the rest of our lives.
Next, I'd like to introduce Stanley Blacker, previously Director of Quality Assurance at EPA, currently Chief Special Studies for the Chief of Staff at Port Belvoir Community Hospital.
Dan Goodman, a 30-year relationship. He was a friend, a colleague, a teacher, an outdoorsman, a story collector, and a storyteller. Colleague. In the 1980s at EPA, I had a problem. Too much data, and much of it wrong. Dan had the solution: data quality objectives, asking hard questions and demanding quantitation. Dan knew how to marry environmental heterogeneity and uncertainty with Bayesian statistics. In the 1990s, he directed his focus to Hanford's high-level radioactive waste disposal. There were 177 1-million-gallon tanks underground containing waste from plutonium production. Sampling was expensive and life-threatening. Dan developed statistical techniques to estimate concentration and distribution of key constituents in each tank. Dan expanded the soil column and groundwater contamination characterization using Bayesian and Kriging statistical techniques and quantitative three-dimensional graphics to establish plume boundaries and cleanup priorities. During this 20-year relationship that I had as a colleague with Dan produced many valuable technical products and became the cornerstone for EPA and Hanford cleanup efforts. The outdoorsman. Dan moved to Montana to be outdoors. It took me a few trips to Montana and to Bozeman to understand why someone with Dan's professional talents moved to Bozeman. I soon realized that Dan chose Bozeman because he could hunt, fish, and hike, and in between would mentor his students and do applied research at Montana State. It was simply quality of life that brought him here. Dan's German hair, short hair pointers, his extensive gun collection. Whenever I was here and the Livingston Gun Show was in town, I was always there with him. His canoes, his 1960s era hunting and fishing cars, his Jeeps, his Pontiac, his Cadillacs, each having a specific purpose. His extensive wardrobe of khaki attire, his fall antelope hunts, his annual hope for a moose, elk, sheep, or goat permit, his daily fall bird hunts, his spring fishing expeditions timed to specific insect hatches, his deference to Dan Gustafson, fly fishing skills, his constant exploratory hikes, always with dogs, to find statistically likely locations for hunting successes. For several years, I would visit Bozeman 10 times a year to share all this with Dan, the outdoorsman. Although I did not enjoy hunting or fishing, I loved the hikes. On one winter trip, Dan and I decided to try snowmobiling. Off to Cook City to explore the Beartooth. Dan wanted the real thing, dog sleds, but had to settle for machines. Dan was impressed, and in 45 minutes he reached a location in the Beartooth that took him during the summer 2.5 days to hike into. I believe that this was the only time Dan ever snowmobiled. Once was enough, and I was lucky I got to share it with him. Story collector and storyteller. Dan loved the rugged outdoor individualists he found everywhere in Montana. Each had his own experiences, and Dan loved to listen. Dan's frequent visits to Havre and to Harold's Exxon station filled his storybooks. Railroad stories, fire hydrant, Israeli friends and relatives during the Israeli efforts to gain statehood, getting into Ohio State, antelope hunts for the single shot, Manhattan, Montana, rental property, the White House, Hanford stories over dinners at the Red Lion in Richland. As we hiked, I was lucky to listen to Dan's many stories, sometimes reminiscing when we were the story. Dan gave my 3 children and my wife Rita the Montana experience that few ever get. Shooting, hiking, fishing, Yellowstone many times, some at night and during the fires. And 2 years ago with my Marine Andy, outdoors overnight in the real backcountry in Montana. Dan, the dogs, and my oldest son and I decided one trip to tackle Mount Blackmore. I was never so exhausted on the way back, but Dan and my son enjoyed a great late dinner while I recovered in my hotel room. That 12-hour hike showed me how tough Dan really was. There were the Frontier Pie work sessions, pickle barrel sandwiches and ice cream, Ken's Motel on 7th Street for those that remember eons ago, Jim Pickett and Dan keeping and renewing EPA and DOE contracts, Chico's, the 80 acres on 19th Street, land by Bozeman Pass, Dan's days as a kid in Cincinnati, and yeshiva training. On one visit, Dan, out of left field, told me that he was going to get married, and I was going to go to dinner that evening with Diane. It was rare that Dan would show his happiness, but that evening he beamed. In our last conversation, just before he went to Houston, Dan shared how proud he was of Raleigh's academic successes and her interest in math and quantitation. Dan always was proud of Raleigh. I'm sure because, to me, she and Dan are very much alike. So many memories. Future adventures and discussions with Dan are no more. Dan, we will love you, and my family will treasure the many times we had together with you in Bozeman and in D.C. Raleigh and Diane, the Blacker family will always be there for both of you. Thank you.
Next is Tim Reagan, longtime friend and colleague, Executive Director of the U.S. Marine Medal Commission.
My laptop failed shortly after I got the request to give a talk, and so I wrote down just a few notes on Dan's remarkable qualities. Obviously, I can't do all of this. It's really great to hear these other stories. A lot of things in common, but so many new things. I really want to focus on what Dan meant to me. And it's a little bit hard to talk in a situation like this for two reasons for me. One is because it's sad and I'm at my heart a pretty emotional person. The other one was that whenever I was in the presence of Dan Goodman, the first thing that came to mind, shut up, you're going to listen, and you're going to learn something. And I always did. I need to tell you a little bit about myself so you can appreciate what Dan meant to me. I grew up about 45 miles from here in Townsend. I knew a lot of the places that Dan knew. I graduated from high school at the top of my class. The other three were farm kids. They could care less. But I had a really solid C+ average. Solid, maybe stretching a bit, but I'm also partly Irish, so I'm allowed to do that. But I struggled a lot as a young kid. I was 6 or 7 years behind Dad, but those were tough times. I was raised in a very religious family, and I couldn't quite make sense of that. My mom sits at the left side of the Pope, and he at her right hand. And I could not put it together and see how it all worked, and I kept struggling for how do I make sense of this world and this life that I'm living, even in high school. So grades 1 hour was the biggest thing. When I graduated, I went on to a school in another part of this state that I don't think you guys know the word for it, so I won't mention it. But even there I struggled a lot, and it was looking to make sense of the world. Vietnam was a big thing. Race relations were a big thing. I was looking out at a big world from a very small portal in Montana and trying to figure out how do I do this. I didn't tell Dan this, but I actually took my first college statistics course in Missoula. There, I've said it. And when I got my grade, I looked at it and I saw I got a D. And I was so grateful. I hadn't earned it. I think it's because I bumped into the professor one day at the student union. But I was struggling a lot trying to make sense of things. I went on and I had a couple of short careers doing different things, and I finally decided I'll go back to school, and I did. And I had the great fortune of being accepted into Scripps, and there I went and I met some really, really smart people, and quite a few of them are sitting in this room, and I hope you get to know them or know them now. And so things started to make a little bit more sense, but that is where I had my first contact with Dan, and what I would call my first Dan Goodman moment. And you've all had them. We've talked a lot about them, especially my colleagues, the people who were students of Dan's, where we had this study group. We sat in a room with people from the upper campus, UCSD, and Southwest Fisheries Science Center, and I was from Scripps, and a few other people were too, and we would sit and talk about problems. Well, one day Dan was visiting, and he came in and he sat and he listened to us. And he sat there as he usually does, and then after about an hour, and we poked and prodded at the issue before us and really couldn't resolve it, and he did his thing. He got up, he went to the chalkboard, and as you know, he started writing things on the chalkboard. He says, okay, this is what I'm hearing, this is what I think the problem is, and here's where we need to go. Well, I was stunned. I didn't get to know Dan personally after that for a while, but I went back and I said, this guy can help me. He can make sense of things. Nobody can do what he just did. couldn't be a great help to me. So I went out and I found all the things that I could that he had published, and I put them in a notebook, much like that one. And I read them, and then I reread them, then I read them a third time, and some of them 4 or 5 times, and I should probably go back and do it again. But they were just remarkable things, full of insight, and I'm so glad that they're still there and we can still read them yet again. Dan did that sort of thing over and over again, as you know, as the students know. It was just stunning. The thing that I thought was wonderful about it, though, was that it wasn't just his analytical ability. He could sit there and he could say, what are the parts of your problem? How do we put these into a conceptual whole? Where are the inconsistencies or the gaps, and how might we fill those? And all of a sudden you'd come out and you'd say, I understand the world a bit more than I did before. But it wasn't just his analytical abilities. He also had, as people had mentioned, this tremendous scholarly approach and background. I remember sitting in Florida once. We were at a conference on the status of manatees. And we were talking about their status under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. And after our talks, 4 of us were asked to sit up in a room a little bit like this with a very large crowd. We were elevated above the crowd a bit, and we were going to be a panel. They asked us questions. And one of the persons in the audience asked a question that was on a finer point of law. Well, Dan said, I better take this. And so he started off and he said, there was a treatise done in the 12th century, and off he went. And I thought, okay, this really highlights Dan. Think of the contrast here. Because I'm sitting right next to him, and I'm thinking, okay, it's 2003. Every year we add 1 to the year before. If you work backward, I can see where hypothetically we might have had a 12th century, but that's about as far back. It was just astonishing to see his overall abilities, and I'm learning more today about them. Now I could stop here because I think his accomplishments in that realm would be really remarkable and worthy of a lifetime of great achievement. But as we've talked, he made another great gift, and I can look around and see them in the audience. They're his students, whom I think will carry on. I told some of them earlier that I thought what Dan really did was to start a pyramid scheme. There was a reverse pyramid scheme, and instead of money, the collateral was knowledge. And you didn't pass it up the pyramid, you passed it down. So it went from him to this cohort of students that he had. Now those students are the brightest and the best and the most achieved and the most accomplished and the most reliable people we have in our field. They are just stunning and wonderful. And they have, with Dan, had such a tremendous effect on my field, and I know I worked in other fields, but on marine mammal science, it's just been phenomenal. So I think we have to acknowledge that he will live on through his students. I could stop there, and I could say that would be another life well lived. But now I want to tell you something that I think a lot of you will know, but maybe not all of you will agree with. But I think Dan's intellect was not his strong suit. He was remarkable. Many of my friends called him a genius, but I think his genius was rivaled much by his heart. Dan was astounding to me, and I would make 4 arguments to support, or give you 4 measures to support my argument. The first one is that Stephen is going to get up here, and you saw with the pictures that Dan had this incredible love of the outdoors. I don't know where he got that. I grew up in Montana. I was exposed to the things that you were looking at in the pictures on a regular basis, so I had a sense of that. I don't know where Dan got it, but he had it. And it tells me that he can love things that are not necessarily just like himself. And I don't find that as a really common trait in the world today. We're awfully almost a species obsessed with ourselves in so many ways. Dan was not. The second argument that I would make was one related to courage, or I would say control or composure. I have thought so much about Dan and his ability to look at the world and make sense of it. As scientists, we're trained to look for patterns and try and understand and explain them. And as I look around the world and I see the patterns that I see, there are times it really scares the heck out of me. I don't quite know what to do with them. But then I imagined, okay, what in God's name does Dan do? His incredible ability to see patterns, to see what's going on in the world, must tell him that there must be all sorts of alarms going off in his head. How do we deal with this? How do we deal with that? Yet he did. I never saw him lose composure. I never saw him get upset about something that he didn't try then to say, this is how we might approach it. He always had that incredible control that was so mysterious to me, but it was so wonderful. So I have great respect for that ability, even though I don't understand it. The third argument that I would make has a lot to do with kindness and patience. And here, this is going to be a bit of an odd analogy, but I'll make it anyway. When you think of a mother or a father, and they're holding their baby in their hands, and they swaddle that baby, and they hold it, and they love it, they do that despite the fact that occasionally it makes messes. It poops in its diapers. It does all sorts of things. And you don't imagine at that time that the mother or father goes, oh, that stinks, or, oh, what have you done? Well, in my career, I have made lots of messes. I've tried to do a lot of good things. I've tried to do some good things, but frankly, a lot of them have backfired, and I have had to call on Dan over and over again. On monk seals, stellar sea lions up in Alaska, and at the Marine Mammal Commission in particular. Dan never came in and never said to me, oh, Tim, what have you done? He never said, oh, this is gross. He never got upset. What he said was, maybe there's another way we can look at this. And maybe I can help you get through it. And then he would lead me out of my mess. So I thought he was absolutely remarkable in his composure and his kindness, because I did make a lot of big messes, and I probably will continue to do so. I'm worried about who's going to get me out of them down the road. The last argument that I would make is his family. And Dan was wonderful, and here I have two stories that I want to tell. The first one was that my wife Wendy and I used to get to meet occasionally, and most of the time I would go meet with Dan when he came to Washington, D.C., and we would have dinner, and we would talk about the world and all of the things that were going on. But every once in a while, Wendy would come with us. And she would sit and enjoy our conversation, and then one time on the way home, I said, what do you think of Dan? Isn't he something remarkable? Isn't he just so bright? And she looked at me and she said, well, yes, I suppose. But she said, what I really love is the way he talked about his family. And it reminded me that in all the things that we drew from Dan, and we called on him all the time, because we were always trying to face problems and figure out solutions, and he was our go-to person. We knew that when we asked him to come, that this was no small thing. It took time from him, but it took time from you guys too. And that's quite a sacrifice. I travel, and I know what it's like to leave my wife behind, and I hate it most of the times. But I know he did it, and he did it under really tough circumstances. I called him one time, and I said, Dan, we're having an annual meeting in Anchorage, Alaska. And it's on the 8th of February. And we're going to tackle this ecosystem problem, and we really need your help. We've been struggling with it, we can't deal with it. And he'd say, oh, geez, Tim, he'd say, I have to be in Portland on the 4th of February, and on the 5th and 6th, I'm down in La Jolla, and then I've got this silver mineral thing in Phoenix on the 7th. So I just don't know how I can possibly be in Anchorage on the 8th. And of course, my response would be, well, Dan, what time did your meeting get over in Phoenix? Because I know there's a 7 o'clock flight from Phoenix to Salt Lake City and a 9:30 from there to Seattle. And there's always an 8 o'clock flight from Seattle to Anchorage the next day. We'll get you there, and we'll just postpone that part in the agenda. And here's where I learned about Dan's major character flaw. He would ask me, is this really important? And I used to think, He's trusting my judgment. Wow. And of course, I always said yes, it was. And he always said, okay, I'll do what I can. And there he would be, come the 8th, would be in our meeting, and 45 minutes or an hour after the plane had landed, in would walk in, and I would breathe a sigh of relief and think, oh, this is so great. But I never forgot that that meant extra days away from you guys, and meant that you were making a sacrifice too. And so I really want to leave you with a message, and in part I'm here because there was just no way to not come when it's Dan. And there's no way to not recognize what you guys have contributed as well to us, even though you may not have seen all the details. But it was incredible and it was wonderful. So I want you to know that wherever you are and whatever you need, and I think I speak for everybody in the room, we all know that there's a 7 o'clock out of Phoenix. And we can get there if we need to and if you need us. I will end with a statement that Tom Royer quoted from Mitch's album in this group of tributes that we're putting together. And he said, death ends a life, but it doesn't end a relationship. And I thought that was so wonderful because we still have so much to learn from Dan. He will be with me always. I will take great pride in having been a friend, and because he let me worship him almost. He was my hero. And I will not forget who he is. And my relationship will go on with him for as long as I have gray matter that still fires. So thank you very much for what you have done, and however we can repay, we will be there.
Last among friends and colleagues, I'd like to introduce Steve Swartz, who's currently co-director of the Laguna San Ignacio Ecosystem Science Program in Baja California Sur, Mexico.
Well, I've known Dan Goodman most of my professional career, so that's about 20 plus years. And initially, we would meet at conferences, workshops, hearings, and whatnot, doing what we could to contribute to the science of the issue of the day. And then, of course, there's lunches and dinners, and we'd sit down and got to know each other better, and soon discovered that we had a number of things in common, a number of interests in common, and perhaps we might try and exploit those to our mutual benefit. That went on for a few years, and then Dan approached me one day and said, you know what, once in a while I get a student that's interested in marine mammals, and that's my major field. Would you consider serving on the academic committees of such students, which means you'd have to come to Bozeman a couple times a year, perhaps, for oral defense or a thesis defense and presentation. I said, sure, we can do this, Dan. So that started my involvement with some of Dan's academic activities. The first one, though, was scheduled in the dead of winter. I'm not a skier. And so afterward, it went well. I said, Dan, the next time, let's schedule this for the summer so we could spend a few extra days and chase some trout. And he said, okay, it's a deal. It's a deal. So for the past 12 years, right after the 4th of July, I'd pack up my stuff and catch a flight out here. Dan would meet me, which whatever car was the car of the day. And we'd head off, take a look at the Forest Service map, go to some places that were favorites that we knew we'd have a good time at, but we'd also go to places that we'd never been to because we like to explore. Basically, our mission was to boldly go where we had not gone before, to seek out new streams and pools, then may hold the promise of trout, and have some fun, which we did. Now, Montana's big sky country. And to get from point A to point B often involves a lot of driving, and so you spend innumerable hours in the car, sometimes late into the night, which gives you an opportunity to talk about a lot of things, and you get to know someone quite a bit. As we already know, Dan is quite opinionated about some things. For example, the subject of music. He's well versed in music, but there's only one kind, classical. End of story. Now, a fellow fishing friend of ours, Charles Kelly, and I once spent a couple of days on a trip with Dan, which meant a lot of time in the car talking, trying desperately to convince Dan there were other notable bits of music out there. I mean, come on, diversity is great. There was jazz, there was folk, there's bluegrass, pop, contemporary music, and so on. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, the Beatles, Los Lobos, What I Like About You was what you wanted to go. The Beatles, to no avail. Dan was steadfast, firm in his conviction. Then something happened. It was not uncommon, as we saw in one of the photographs, when you're hanging out with Dan, that people would mistake him for Jerry Garcia. And he actually kind of liked that, because he would smile and wave and just keep walking. So I saw an opportunity and I took a chance. I knew that Garcia's roots were in bluegrass, and I played the bluegrass group. It's one of my favorite things to do. And so I very carefully, before coming out the following summer, selected a dozen or so pieces that were classic bluegrass tunes done by a number of people. And I burned them on a CD and brought that with me. So then late one night, driving back from who knows where, Dylan or something like that. And I slipped the CD in the car player and turned it up a little bit. Now Dan was over in the passenger seat kind of snoozing because we had a long day. But when the music came on, he kind of woke up and looked at me and said, "Who's that?" And so with each track, I told him who it was, what the group was. We knew the origin of the song, it was folk traditional, or it was something new that someone had written. And tried to explain as best I could to him what he was listening to. Midnight Moonlight by Peter Rowan featured a great, great violin by Buster Clemens. Holding Them Away, where Garcia has a great banjo solo. Fantastic. Just an Old Hobo featured Dave Grusin on the mandolin, and so on and so on. The tunes played into the night. I kept my monologue going. And when it was over, I looked over at Dan and said, "What did you think?" He looked at me and he said, "Those guys are really good. Really tight. You know, they may have a future in music." "You think?" I said. "Maybe we should write them, Dan, and let them know." We listened to that CD and others I brought in subsequent summers over and over again. In fact, this past summer I was rummaging through the Suburbans glove box looking for a flashlight, and I found that CD and a few others. Dan had hung on to them. He also had some obsessions. One of his obsessions was legendary giant brook trout. Oftentimes when he said we're going to someplace new, what was behind it was he had spoke to Dustin or someone and told him there's a chance of finding some big brookies there. And that was okay, that was fun. So we went to a lot of great places. But after a while, I began to think this is another urban myth, or Montana myth. I said, these fish just don't exist anymore. They don't. We caught some really nice brook trout, but no giants. So he took me out to Bailey's Fly Shop in Livingston. We walk in and the walls are plastered with wooden cutouts of record fish that had been caught in the region over the years. And some of them were really nice brook trout. So I agreed with them. I said, okay, they're out there somewhere. Well, we never found a good brook trout. But rumors of large brooks and cutthroats in Red Rocks took us there many, many times. And we trampled all over that place, and we never caught a really big brook trout. We caught some nice fish, and we brought a few home. Now, the small fish, of course, are tender and tasty. The larger ones get a little tough and stringy, but Diane, bless her heart, developed a black bean and garlic sauce for those large fish that just really makes them great. Really, really perfect. So about a month after I got home from this last trip, I got an email from Dan. I'll try to read it. So I finally verified the large brook trout part of the story. for Red Rock Creek. I walked about a half-mile farther downstream than we did this year, caught a black bean sauce grade fish. A Joe's hopper fished in fast water, entering the top of a small pool. The water was not crystal clear. The walking was tedious because of uneven surfaces obscured by tall grass to no avail. So, with all of his achievements, Dan also has one. He has coined the new standard for large, good trout, the black bean sauce grade, which I will use from here on out to talk about a good fish. He also left us with another little phrase that's a favorite of mine. That's fish more, worry less. Well,
Finally, I'd like to invite up Dan's daughter, Raleigh Goodman, currently a junior studying economics and computer science at Lewis and Clark in Portland, Oregon.
Well, I'm not very good at speaking, but I had to try because, well, we've already heard so much about my father today. Not nearly enough, but so much. And there's so much more to say about someone so unique. And that's why every time I'd sit down and try to write something for this, and it would always go in 15 directions at once, and I didn't know what to do about that. And then I realized that was kind of okay, because it kind of reminded me of the stories he used to tell me. I had so many stories, as so many of you know, but we'd be at the dinner table and something, you never knew what, something would remind him of something, and he'd launch into a full explanation of the complete history of almost anything you could think of, and then that would connect to another story, and then that would connect to another story, and that would connect to another story. And you could it was kind of a fun game to just wait and see how it connected back to whatever you had first said. Sometimes, it always did, and it always surprised you. But I don't think there was a single thing he didn't know. And I never trusted anyone's opinion more than his. He was brilliant, and everyone knew he was brilliant. You could see that 2 minutes after meeting him, but that was one of his best qualities, is that he would be quiet and he'd be self-assured even when he knew he was right and I was wrong. And I was wrong a lot. But I hadn't written this, but there was one time I can think of that he was wrong. He'd been, no, I'm serious, one time. We'd been out fishing, my mother and I and my dad. We were out, I don't even remember where, somewhere remote, and we had a pretty good day of fishing. I remember it was a nice creek. I think we caught some brook trout, and we got back to the car as it was getting dark, and we had a flat tire. And now this was in the new Suburban, so Dad had rolled his old truck previously, a couple of years ago. We'd never had to change a tire on this car, but he taught me how to change tires. I figured, it wasn't a big deal, And a little backstory for this is I was 13 or 14 at the time, and like every teenager, I was permanently plugged into my iPod, and my dad was always, giving me flack about being that stupid iPod and all that, he hated the thing. Well, as it turned out, he hadn't brought a flashlight. So we ended up trying to change a tire on a car we were unfamiliar with, in the dark, using the light from my iPod. so of course, this is going great in the first place. But then getting this tire out of the car, the spare tire was hooked up into the car, and it was like trying to push a truck up a hill with a rope, trying to get this thing out. And so there was this bizarre tool you're supposed to use to take the tire out, and Dad's sitting there, he's struggling with it, he's going to be the man, he's going to get the tire down. And I keep saying, Dad, I don't think you're doing it. Dad, I don't think that's right. And meanwhile, the charge of my iPod's going. So finally, I just, 13-year-old Raleigh takes the tool from Dad, flips it over to the other end, and gets the tire. that was the one time I've been right. And I never let him forget that. I actually got the tire changed and got home. It was fine, but he still got to hear about that all the time. But generally he was right, but he never acted superior. He'd just patiently sit there and he'd wait for me to realize my mistake. And it was because he was so patient, among so many other reasons, that he was one of the greatest teachers that the world has ever known. And for some, that may have been the only side of him that they ever got to know. You know, many people, more people than I ever knew about, had the fortune of knowing him as a colleague and as a world-class professor and as a loyal friend. But I was the only one lucky enough to have him as a father, too. And my childhood memories of my dad, they're a really strange mix. You know, half of it is listening to NPR at the kitchen table and working through calculus proofs. But then there's the other half, which is things like, you know, decorating the canoe in our living room with Hanukkah lights. We have this, my mom got a video camera shortly before I was born. We have a bunch of baby videos of me, and one of them are maybe a year old. And we have a video of him trying to read the children's books, Fox and Socks, to me, if you're familiar with that. And I always threaten to show that video to the students. I really wish I had. They probably saw him as a lot more mysterious and stately than that. But it was contrasts like that that made having him as a father so incredible. Because he wasn't just my dad. He was also my teacher and my mentor and my personal inspiration. There was no higher praise than to get a compliment from him. There will never be any higher praise than that. And I know so many young women who say that one day they hope they can find a man like their father. And that's great, but my aspirations are higher than that. I hope someday I can be like my father. I want to be able to fight the good fight for as long as he did. I hope I'll value keeping my word as highly as he did. And I hope I can inspire as many people and have as many stories to tell. I could have listened to his stories forever. In the end, I think what really made my dad so inspirational was that he was able to see so much that was ugly in the world, and yet he was still completely in love with it. He fought for what was right, despite all the frustrations, even when it seemed like a losing battle. And he suffered setbacks and disappointments that would have made most people just give up. But then we'd hike up Grouse Mountain or along the Madison River for a while, and suddenly, as far as he was concerned, everything was right in the world. He still had it in him to read the Man-Eaters of Savo from cover to cover every winter, and to dream of safaris in Africa. I wasn't ready to live life without him, and I don't know if I ever would have been, but certainly not right now. I don't know how I'll do it, but I will. Even though there's infinitely much more he could have taught me, I already learned so much from him. I'm grateful for that, but I know it won't make everything easier. I'll always miss him, and I already do. I'm proud to be his daughter. Now all I can do is to take everything he taught me and hope I can always make him proud to be my father. And I've got a message from my mother here that I'd love to read for everyone. I was so blessed to have had the privilege of sharing 31 incredible years with Daniel, a profoundly unique and gifted man. He enriched my life in a myriad of ways, and I will always remain his #1 fan. Although his voice and intellect are quiet and the void looms large, his spirit, his legacy, and all that was superlative about Daniel will echo in my heart and life forever, as I know it will in yours as well. Thankfully, he lives on in our daughter. I would like to thank all of you for coming today to relive memories and commemorate this extraordinary man. Your presence honors him, fills me with pride, and provides consolation. I especially thank Dave, Peter, Stanley, Tim, and especially Stephen and the Department of Ecology for your heartfelt and moving tributes to our Daniel, as well as those who could not attend but sent moving memoirs of him. Thank you.
You know, in addition to those who were fortunate enough to be able to travel and be here, there were many, many more who were not able to make it here, that sent their tributes. And so, in addition to the people here today, we have a collection of those tributes. And I'd like for all of you to take the opportunity just to spend a little bit more time with us to share some of those personal stories and experiences. There's some refreshments outside for those that are thirsty and a little bit in need. And I guess what I'd like to say on behalf of those that could be here and those who couldn't, when you see what a wonderful family Dan had and what extraordinary colleagues he attracted to his side during his career, it's really testament to an extraordinary individual and a life well lived, although too short. So, thanks for coming to be with us and sharing some remembrances of an extraordinary man.
You know, another thing was funny too. Ever read about the Lyme disease?
Here we are.
Have you heard about the
Candid camera.
Yeah, on video, alive.
Yeah.
Gotta be careful what we say.
Yeah. Stephen, Robin, and Carrie. There's Jimbo. Some people I don't know.
Hello.
Hi
Taking
there.
pictures here. Well, you're the time that you
Smile. Say hi.
You need a warm up on that, don't you? Get one of you two in. A little more? A little more?
It's nice to see you.
Just half. Filming you eating.
Say hi.
You better get a picture of those important guys down on the end. The girls? Who, Grandma? No, I don't think she was talking about us. I have no idea. No idea. I always liked it. No, we have an elevator in the building.
Tim, Rudy, Joan, Lori, Yoni. I'll stand on my tiptoes to get Yoni. There. Camera was focusing on the light in the back.
It might not be a farm.
Say hello.
That's what I mean.
It's there. The exposure isn't good.
It's okay, you're not missing anything.
George, what are you doing? I got you. And here's the paper dolls plus Ken and Barbie. Say hello, girls.
You're in the States now?
We have a.
You're a member of, in a sense. I'm terminated.
So we're down there.
Oh, I see. So, do you represent Bozeman? Yes. The Senate is chief
Social Security was not going to take it. Medicare is not. I'm sure someone would be really interested in Medicare. And a lot of it is.
In the food spread, what's left of it. Nice flowers. More flowers.
I don't know, just sandwiches to take out. Well, you probably never heard of it, but, there might be some problems. There's also
It's like Dancing with the Stars. Everybody has to
Really
hire and go by.
that helps, especially Korea. So that may have been, if you've ever read anything about the trade agreement. So yeah, I'm really interested in structures and institutions and all sorts of things that politics.
There's Tim. Got to eat. And Jim.
You got me reading?
And all these guys. Finish up where I started.